Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we have a presentation on the internment camps of World War II. But of course, you can't understand the internment camps without understanding the history of anti-Asian nativism in U.S. history. So we're going to go back a little bit to try to go forward. So let's get this presentation started. In 1941, Japan did attack Pearl Harbor, and a famous attack that will live in infamy. A few months later, in 1942, the U.S. government made a decision that all Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans on the West Coast need to be imprisoned. That's over 125,000 souls, human beings, that were locked up without a trial. And they're going to be put in prison camps. Here's one of the more famous ones, and that's how they're going to live for the next 2, 3, 4 years. So this is one of the ugliest stains on U.S. history, and that's why we're studying it. We're understanding how they got there, and hopefully maybe gain some insight on how we can prevent moments like this in the future. So again, why did that happen? How did that happen? And to do that, we're going to have to understand our history a little bit. So we're going to study a little history, specifically the history of hate in the United States, specifically the history of hate towards Asian immigrants, and of course Asian Americans. So we're going to look at that history, and that should give us some insight on why this happened. Certainly some context. So number one, study of the history of hate. In 1849, California discovered gold. This is the famous gold rush, the San Francisco 49ers, because the gold was discovered in 1849. And so for the next 2 years, it would be some crazy going on there. Lots of people traveling to California. Now, this included 25,000 Chinese immigrants to go there to look for gold that migrated to the United States. Now, this is going to lead to a backlash of hate because, of course, the people of China acted differently than the average American at that point, and that's going to lead to white Americans being like, they're different, I don't want them here. A little bit of fear, hate, and certainly racism and nativism. Now, in addition to that, around the 1850s, even a little bit earlier, the United States became committed to building railroads. But right around that time, we're going to start being committed to building the transcontinental railroads that span the continent. So the railroad companies don't have enough workers, don't have laborers. So they're going to actually send ships to recruit over in China. And from 1850 to 1882, 322,000 Chinese immigrants are going to be recruited and come to the United States to build these railroads. Now that's also going to create a backlash of hate. White Americans are going to notice that there is more and more Chinese immigrants in the United States. And they look different, they worship different, they act different, speak differently, and that's going to create some condescending hate. And that backlash is going to culminate to, in 1870, white racists are going to be upset. They're saying, wow, we have so many businesses run by Chinese migrants here. 25% of the workers are Chinese. This is going to lead to fear, this idea that the yellow peril, yellow being kind of a racial epitaph, a negative term, a pejorative term used to describe Asians coming over to take over the country, but yellow peril and coming from China. They're going to be taking over our country. The Chinese, are famous for having opium and being drugged out all the time. They're willing to work less for less money, which means they're going to drive down salaries. We call that deflation. They're going to take our jobs because they're willing to work for less. They're going to take our land. They are. Eventually, they're going to overtake everybody on the West Coast and enslave the white race. So the New York Tribune, it kind of has this quote that demonstrates kind of the mentality of the U.S. at the time. They are uncivilized, unclean, and filthy beyond conception. Lustful, every female is a prostitute of the basest order. The first words of English that they learn are terms of obscenity or profanity. Beyond this, they care to learn no more. Could they have a more negative view? Very much incorrect and full of racism and hate. In 1882, white racists convinced Congress, and Congress at least heard their views, that they should pass a bill. And they did pass a bill called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what it basically did was it said Chinese are not allowed to come to the U.S. anymore. Sorry, we will accept migrants from every country except China. Every country except one, and that would be China. So that, if there's nothing, Chinese Exclusion Act, I don't know if there's anything more filled with hate. So that should give some context of how Americans treated Asian immigrants for the internment camps. But we've got more to talk about beyond the gold rush, the railroads, and the Chinese Exclusion Act. More evidence of American nativism is in 1906, San Francisco, California. took 93 Japanese elementary children who previously were spread out over 23 elementary schools, and then suddenly there was a fire, right? And so a bunch of schools got damaged, and they had to reshuffle the kids, but there wasn't enough space because a bunch of the schools got damaged. So what did? They segregated and said that, well, Japanese children, you can't come to these schools anymore. They kicked them out of those schools and said, you can go to a school really, really far away. But of course, this was a time where, the cars were not prevalent, certainly. It was too far away for them to walk, so these elementary kids, these Japanese children, were not allowed to go to school. There could not be a more inequitable policy. I mean, think about it. You don't provide education for people because of their race that will impact their futures incomes, their future well-being. Is there anything more cruel than using discrimination and racism against children? So that's hateful, right? So again, the segregation and kicking elementary kids out of school in San Francisco in 1906 and all that time, awful, right? West Coast segregation. Now, why was there so much hatred from the United States towards the Japanese children? Well, let's talk about that. In the 1800s, the United States was the nation of immigrants, right? Thousands of businesses existed, and, they needed workers, right? But as of 1882, as thousands of businesses existed and they wanted workers, there were less workers. Why? Because in 1882, the most populated country in the world, China, was no longer allowed to send immigrants. So the United States needed workers. Workers are needed, immigrants are needed to expand businesses, expand our economy. So where do you look for workers? Well, you can't be China, we banned them, and Japan was the answer. So from 1869 to 1907, there were plenty of people in Japan that migrated to the United States to fill that void, to stimulate our economy, to fill those working positions in those American-owned businesses. So Japan's going to send over 200,000 immigrants at this time. And because the west coast of the United States is closest to Japan, that's exactly where they're going to go, most of them. And that's going to create white fear. The yellow peril is coming for white Americans. They're overtaking our country, taking our jobs, taking our land. They're going to enslave the white race. An example of this hatred would be, again, San Francisco was so frustrated with the Japanese that they segregated their children to kick their kids out of school. And that's a lot of hate that would lead to that. Now, did San Francisco keep segregating Japanese children? No, because in 1906, Japan got so mad about how their children were being treated that they threatened war. Teddy Roosevelt said, I don't want war with them. So ultimately, he made a treaty with them, and it was made in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But it was called the Gentleman's Agreement, and basically, I was incorrect about that. It was not the Treaty of Portsmouth, but the Gentleman's Agreement was the name of it, and it basically said, Japan, you need to stop sending your people here. We have too much unskilled labor. It's upsetting people, and Japan agreed not to send any more unskilled labor. They were trying to avoid the U.S. passing a Chinese Exclusionary Act, but for them this time, because that would be degrading and condescending. So they just voluntarily said, we'll stop sending them. So 1906, but in return, their kids got to go to school, and we would stop discriminating against them in San Francisco and anywhere else, hopefully. So that said, in the entire world as of 1906, everybody was allowed to send immigrants to the land of immigrants, except two countries, and that would be China and Japan. That is a whole lot of hate right there. So again, we've talked about a lot of things: the Gold Rush Railroads, the Chinese Exclusionary Act, San Francisco segregation of young children, and the Gentleman's Agreement. Other examples of nativism? Sure. White racists, of course, were applauding the Gentleman's Agreement, and they were happy by it. But there was a loophole in the Gentleman's Agreement made by Teddy Roosevelt. From 1907 to 1924, Japanese men who were here wanted to get married. So the loophole was they could get married and bring their wives in. So this was a time period called picture brides. Basically, pictures would be sent over, and people would pick their brides from the pictures, and then once they picked them, they would be basically given a boat ride over to the United States, and then they would get married, and then they would, fall in love perhaps, and then have children. And at this point, the Japanese population will explode, even though Japanese were banned from coming here. They could still come here. So white racists were mad because they thought they had banned unskilled labor coming in from Japan, and yet the population was still massively going up. So what did America do to stop this, to satisfy their racist beliefs? They passed the National Origins Act of 1924 during the administration of Calvin Coolidge. So picture brides no longer allowed. Japan wasn't allowed to send anybody here, 0%. So, that wall got bigger between Asia and the United States. White racists were happy, and there's no better example of hate, right? So that said, picture brides, National Origins Act of 1924, Other examples of nativism. Number 4, the United States passed laws of the Asian people that lived here that they were not allowed to own property. And those laws were passed in all the states that you see stars on, not just the West Coast. So again, immigrants weren't allowed to come from Japan or China, but those that did live from Japan and China were not allowed to own property. Now, again, this is completely discriminatory. It was meant to get the people that were already here to leave. They couldn't own property. They would leave, and these were called the alien land laws. Now, again, that's a lot of states that passed them. Now, denying a whole race the right to have a home, to buy land, that's pretty discriminatory. That's pretty sad, and that's exactly what the United States had done. Now, it was against the Constitution to say that a race couldn't buy a home, so they instead said aliens ineligible for citizenship. So that was their way to get around the 14th Amendment in the Constitution. Now, has this ever been changed? Are Asian Americans and immigrants allowed to buy land? Well, in 1948, 1952, long after World War II, the Supreme Court's going to hear cases about this, and the alien land laws, they're going to decide against. They're going to say, no, that is a violation of the 14th Amendment. You can't target race and then tell them they can't buy land. It totally violates the 14th Amendment, which says everybody is equally protected under the law. So the 14th Amendment was created for former slaves and African Americans, but in this case it was used to get rid of this policy that was anti-Asian. So again, banning owning property, that's going to go away eventually, but it's going to be there for a long time, and a good example of hate in the U.S. So lots of things we talked about, but also, besides property ownership, we have other examples of nativism. And that would be in 1790, during the time of George Washington, our first president, we passed the Naturalization Act of 1790. That's a tough vocabulary term, but try to remember it. The Naturalization Act of 1790 described how you become a citizen. And specifically, what it said was the only people that could become citizens are free white persons. Everybody else can't apply for citizenship. They'd have to be born here. So free white persons, literally that's what it said. So this was meant to prevent freed slaves from becoming citizens, but it's also going to prevent Native Americans and definitely Asian Americans for a long, long, long time. So what's the big deal about citizenship? Who really cares? And the answer is, if you're not a citizen, you can't hold office, so you can't shape laws. You can't vote, so you can't even pick the people that can hold office, so they're going to ignore you. You can't have any influence over the laws because you can't vote, so politicians aren't going to pass laws to help you. Can you imagine how horrible the laws might treat you then? Public officials will completely ignore you because you can't vote. You're not even citizens. And they can be as abusive to you as possible. You can't serve on a jury, so what that means is if you get accused of a crime, nobody like you is going to decide your fate. And you're not going to be able to decide anybody else's fate, particularly if they abuse you. So you're not allowed to testify in court if somebody did something bad to you or somebody you knew. I mean, unbelievable consequences of not being citizens. This is massive hate. So we've talked about gold rush railroads, the Chinese Exclusion Act, San Francisco segregation, the Gentleman's Agreement, picture brides, the National Origins Act of 1924, and no property ownership. Now, we've talked about all these other things about citizenship now, but let's go on. One final example of nativism for today is Asian immigrants came to America and we should welcome them. Except they weren't welcomed. 90%-ish of America was off limits because they were segregated, particularly on the West Coast. They were told they have to live here. Now, what does that mean? This is called a practice called redlining. It's been used against African Americans, but other minorities, but especially Asian Americans. What happens is there were certain areas of cities that Asian Americans could only settle. And the reason was banks would not give them loans to buy homes in other areas. Realtors would not show them homes in those places or sell them homes there, and sellers would not agree to sell them. So white neighborhoods stayed white. The only neighborhoods that Asian Americans were allowed to go into were massively distressed and poor areas. And that is going to be discriminatory and sad. So that's one of the reasons why Chinatowns and Japantowns are so prevalent in the United States, because in those areas we're highly concentrated of the Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants, because they could only live there because of discriminatory practices. So that's kind of the sad origins of these beautiful places today. So again, massive history of nativism against Asian Americans, and lots of examples of that, including redlining, right? So that said, in the context of all that hate, that brings us to 1941, on December 7th, 1941 specifically, when Pearl Harbor happens. So Pearl Harbor gets attacked, our Navy gets destroyed pretty thoroughly, and Americans get scared. Their perception of Japan was they were invincible. Their army hadn't really lost a war or a battle even in like 1,000 years. And they thought that Japan, if they could bomb Pearl Harbor, they're now going to invade at any moment. So come right across the ocean. Now, we know that this was very, very unlikely today, but back then, that mass hysteria. So on January 28th, 1942, not all that long after Pearl Harbor, about 2 months, there's a report that gets released called Robert's Report, a study of where we went wrong at Pearl Harbor. And what that report said was that the ships got sunk at Pearl Harbor because of spies. The Japanese had spied and found out where they were. And that made people be like, there's spies everywhere. And the Japanese are everywhere. They're going to harm us. And that created mass paranoia. They're traitors. Now, do they have a reason to be traitors? Well, that's up for debate. But the point is, if there's an invasion, there's 125 plus Japanese immigrants on the West Coast. So if the Japan invades from the West, all of a sudden we might be fighting them, and then suddenly over 100,000 people attack us from behind. So that's what the concern was. Now, the government concern is the Japanese Americans could join in the fighting, true, but it was mostly about espionage, that they would start attacking the U.S. in our war effort and sabotaging our war effort, right? Both kind of acts of treason, but Americans were concerned. So, number one, the general said they feel that they are living in the midst of a lot of enemies. They don't trust the Japanese, not one of them. So out of 125,000 people that he hadn't even met, that was the prevailing view. Now, what about Japanese Americans? I mean, I understand that you might not trust the immigrants, but the Americans that were born here, the citizens? I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still Japanese. But we must worry about them, about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the map. Now, he's talking about Americans here, Japanese Americans that have never even been to Japan. Number two, the LA Times published this. A viper, which is a snake, is nevertheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents, nurtured upon Japanese traditions, grows up to be Japanese and not an American. Thus, while it might cause injustice to a few to treat them as potential enemies, such treatment should be accorded to each and all of them while we are at war with their race. And that's the whole point. We were at war with Japan, not their race. It's very unfortunate. Number three, prejudice explodes. So immediately, hundreds of thousands of people got things like this, Jap hunting licenses, clearly based on racist thoughts, right? So this would be one haircut place advertised, we'll give free haircuts to Japs. We're not responsible for accidents, though, because they used blades at that point, right? Blades, essentially big knives. Funeral parlors. I'd rather do business with a Jap than an American. Obviously saying we'd rather they be dead, and that's awful. So again, people put up signs, Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Down with the Japs, the rats. I mean, that's a kid holding that. Here's a home of Japanese family with spray paint on it. It's awful. So beware of my dog, Japs. No more Japanese wanted here. A Jap is a Jap. There's not a single Japanese in the country that would not stab you in the back. That's a senator saying that. Not a single person, even a 6-year-old girl. It's crazy discriminatory. So what actions did the U.S. government take? Well, action number one. Life magazine said, all right, well, we're friends with the Chinese, but we're not friends with Japan, so you got to be able to tell the difference. First of all, the Japanese are shorter, and Chinese are taller. The space between the toes of the Chinese don't have that. It's in part because of the footwear the traditional Japanese have worn in Japan. And then they published all types of descriptions about how to tell a Japanese face different from a Chinese face. I mean, all based on these racial ideas and epitaphs. So, action number two, the government then completely banned the Japanese from the West Coast and said, you can't be here. So on February 19th, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, that of course is one of your top vocabulary terms. If you have any more than 1/16th Japanese in your blood, these signs were hung up everywhere. You need to report in 1 week. And on March 24th, 1 month I meant, 1 week, March 24th, 1942, you have 1 week to report. Now, I don't care what you do, you can only take what you can carry. You have to sell your possessions, sell your home, sell your businesses, get rid of your entire life so you can be locked up by the United States of America. Now, temporary grounds were like race grounds and horse stables. And during this time, as they were locked in these temporary shelters, the U.S. got to work building things for the next 6 months. And what they did was they built internment camps, basically camps where the Japanese could be housed for an indefinite amount of time, really, 5, 6, 7 years. 1942, in August, now the Japanese basically had to report to get on trains from these temporary detention centers and get on trains and be shipped out to all of these camps. We basically wanted them away from the West Coast in case the Japanese ever attacked. So, that said, there they go. Now, until they're going to be there till the end of the war. Nobody knows when that is, and nobody knows what type of life they'll have. I mean, they could be gone in 6 months or a year or 4 years. Who knows? Now, in these internment camps, they're awful. They lost their freedom to do anything they wanted. They're guarded by men and guns on horses, but also guard towers. It was overcrowded, which of course leads to the spread of disease. They basically were in converted horse stables. They were in poorly equipped classrooms because, of course, the kids had to go to school. There was no privacy. Things were unsanitary, and the kids lost their childhood. This is where they had to grow up. There was no medical care. Now, how did the prisoners feel about this? Well, they were being treated as if we're criminals. We didn't do anything. They were not given a trial. That's true. I've lived in America for 25 years, and they're locking me up. This is so not okay. I've never even set foot in Japan, and they're treating me like I'm the Japanese. People had to go from having a house to just a room for like 4 years. You wouldn't even let me apply for citizenship, remember? They weren't allowed to apply for citizens, and now you're blaming me that I'm not a citizen? Now, were they allowed to volunteer to fight in the war for the United States, those who were locked up? Well, in 1941, no, we didn't trust them. In 1942, we did not trust them as a country. In 1943, the United States now had enough soldiers dying that they got desperate. They needed more U.S. soldiers. So they sent a survey to everybody that was locked up, 125,000 people, predominantly the men. And there was lots of questions, and two of the questions 27 and 28, basically said, are you willing to serve in the U.S. military? And 28 was, will you swear unqualified allegiance to this country and give up your allegiance to Japan? Now, there's a famous large group of people that said no to both of those questions. They were nicknamed no-nos. So, again, they were like, you want me to pledge our lives to a country that's locked my children up? It was like admitting that you had loyalty to Japan by checking off that you're giving up your loyalty to Japan. If I check this, it justifies them locking me up, and they had no reason to lock me up. I will not leave my family locked up behind barbed wire fences to go put the same uniform on as the sentries that hold guns pointed at us. So anybody who wrote no, they were sent out of the internment camps into maximum security prison away from their families. So most said yes, or many did. And ultimately, many of the Japanese are going to serve in the U.S. military during World War II. 805 internees were accepted, and they fought. About 32,000 Japanese Americans, predominantly from Hawaii, but other places that were not interned, joined the U.S. military for the rest of the war. So they were sent to Europe, so it wouldn't be a confusing situation sending them up against the Japanese. So that said, the most famous group was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Remember, they were segregated into their own group, as were African Americans at the time. And this group's slogan was "Go for broke." That's an expression that means put 100% into this. If we're going to show America that we're willing to die to prove that we're patriotic. So "Go for broke" was their slogan. Over 800 of them did, in fact, pay the ultimate sacrifice and died. In all of U.S. history, no group has had more medals than the regimental group of the Japanese in any war at any time, as compared with any group of its size. 6,000 Japanese Americans, in addition to that well-rewarded group, joined the military intelligence service, and their job was to translate captured Japanese documents, interrogate POWs. On the battlefield, that group even listened to orders and told Americans what the Japanese were yelling at each other, and even yelled out fake orders close up. I mean, very heroic groups of fighters. So what actually happened to the camps at the end of the war? Well, after 4 years, on January 2nd, 1945, the war is not over yet, but it's clear at this point Japan's not going to invade. Executive Order 9066 gets rescinded, and FDR starts creating preparations to let everybody go home. Internment camps closed down. Now, going home wasn't as good as you think because they didn't have homes anymore. They gave up their homes. So what they were given was $25 each and then a train ticket to anywhere in the U.S. But they had nowhere to go. Didn't know if their home was still there. They didn't have a job. And certainly the white Americans there didn't want them back. We don't want any Japs back here ever. So they had nowhere to go. 20,000 internees, in fact, said, please send us back to Japan. In the end, only 5,000 stayed because Japan was pretty messed up after the war. but some did get repatriated back to Japan. And of course, they would want to after what they had been locked up. So Japan at this point, this is one of the ugliest stains in U.S. history. It's so unfair. Did anybody fight back? Well, in 1941, this guy, Fred Korematsu, did. He was 23 years old. He's like, I'm not getting locked up for not doing anything. So he became a welder, and then he got plastic surgery to try to look like a woman, and so that he wouldn't be discovered to be Japanese, and he got arrested. And ultimately went to prison, but he sued the government and said, you have no right. Now, his argument was that the Fifth Amendment gives no person can be deprived of life or liberty without due process. That means being given a trial. He said, I have a right to due process, the right to have a trial to prove that I'm innocent. So he went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to make a decision. So it's Korematsu v. United States, because he's suing the United States. So let's get inside the Supreme Court's head. Now, they examined FDR's order to lock them up, and the U.S. government at this point says, well, I don't have to give due process, a trial, if I'm locking people up, because our Constitution says that I can lock people up without a trial in times of rebellion or invasion, and we were worried about invasion. So, now that said, to lock people up is taking away a fundamental right, their liberty, and the Constitution says, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, you can't get rid of a fundamental liberty unless you have a compelling state interest. That's fancy lawyer talk for saying a really, really, really important government interest is needed in order to take somebody's rights away. Well, so FDR's order, you needed a compelling state interest, and FDR said, we're about to be invaded, so I had to lock them up. They were going to attack us. So this was a military necessity, and they were going to sabotage us. So in the end, the Supreme Court agreed with FDR and said, you're right, 6-3 vote. It was a compelling interest. You were facing invasion and espionage, so Korematsu lost. And at Korematsu v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled that during times of threatened invasion, the government is allowed to lock people up without giving them a trial, or due process was the phrase. Now, that's an ugly stain on history. But there was another point of view. There were 3 Supreme Court justices that disagreed. One of them was Justice Frank Murphy. And under the 14th Amendment, he said, it's not the 5th Amendment we're worried about, it's the 14th. It says everybody gets treated equally before the law, and they were locked up not for national security, but they were locked up because they were Japanese. That's not being treated equally. You can't discriminate based on race. That's a violation of the 14th Amendment. The internment camps, they weren't protecting us. There was no evidence that the Japanese Americans were going to attack America. There's no evidence that they were going to commit massive sabotage or that an invasion was happening. Japan was never prepared to invade the United States. So again, there was no compelling state interest, and therefore this was unconstitutional by the 14th Amendment. This was because of racism, which is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. So those 3 justices got outvoted, but ultimately that was their point of view. So why were the internment camps established? Well, if you think it was because of national security, then the government is allowed to basically suspend due process and the right to have a trial in order to save the country. If you believe this was because of racism, then this is a violation of the 14th Amendment, and they were unconstitutional. So has the United States ever apologized for the internment camps? Well, in 1976, President Ford said, this is a terrible anniversary, February 19th. It was on this date that Executive Order 9066 was issued, resulting in the uprooting of loyal Americans. We now know that we should have known then. Not only was the evacuation wrong, the internment camps, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. I call upon the American people to affirm that we have learned from our tragedy and resolve that this kind of action shall never again be repeated. Okay, well, those are nice words, but it doesn't really make anything better. In 1982, President Reagan put together a commission to study it. The report basically said that the causes of the internment were prejudice, hysteria, and a failure of FDR's leadership, not because of national security. So in the end, that right there says the Supreme Court was wrong too. And in 1988, Ronald Reagan happily signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and it basically said we were sorry. And that former detainees, that are still alive, which was 82,000 of them, were going to get $20,000 each, which amounted to $1.6 billion, $20,000 each. That certainly does not make it better, but it was basically accounting for all the money that they lost by having to sell all of their possessions. So that's 1998, and then 1998 comes, and Fred Korematsu is welcomed to the White House by President Clinton and given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor that a person can do. So that leads to 2018, and the Supreme Court finally, in Trump v. Hawaii, we're not going to talk about that case, but the Supreme Court rules that Executive Order 9066 was unconstitutional. So now we have the president saying it was wrong, Congress saying it was wrong, and giving money, and now the Supreme Court ruled it was wrong. Now the Supreme Court matters because they're the ones that get the final say on everything about the Constitution. So Chief Justice Roberts says the forcible relocation into concentration camps was based on race, and therefore was a violation of the 14th Amendment, and FDR had no right to do it. So in the future, hopefully we can learn from this situation to do better. And I mean, this is an ugly stain on U.S. history, and hopefully we understand how we got there and what we can do to prevent it. But that's a discussion for another time. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and thank you for listening, and hopefully you learned something useful.